I am witnessing what may constitute the most comprehensive assault on constitutional due process rights in modern American history as systematic deportation operations proceed without the legal protections that distinguish democratic governance from authoritarian enforcement, and the scale of constitutional violations occurring daily across American communities threatens to normalize law enforcement tactics that fundamentally contradict the legal framework upon which American justice depends. As I analyze the systematic circumvention of judicial oversight, the deliberate separation of families, including American citizens, and the coordinated strategy to overwhelm immigration courts while denying legal representation, I recognize that we are observing not merely immigration policy enforcement, but the implementation of a comprehensive system of arbitrary detention and removal that violates core constitutional principles while creating precedents that could extend these tactics to any group deemed undesirable by executive authority. The magnitude of the deportation operations currently underway extends far beyond immigration enforcement into systematic challenges to fundamental constitutional protections, including due process rights, equal protection guarantees, and the judicial review mechanisms that prevent arbitrary government action against any residents of the United States. When immigration enforcement proceeds through raids that detain individuals without judicial warrants, separate children from parents without legal process, and remove long-term residents without meaningful court hearings, these tactics violate constitutional principles that protect all persons within American jurisdiction regardless of citizenship status. The 14th Amendment's guarantee that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law applies to all persons, not just citizens, and current deportation practices systematically violate these constitutional requirements while establishing precedents that could be applied to any group that future administrations choose to target for arbitrary enforcement. The systematic separation of families through deportation operations represents not merely humanitarian crisis, but deliberate violation of constitutional rights to family unity that courts have recognized as fundamental aspects of liberty protected by due process guarantees. When immigration enforcement separates American citizen children from their parents, detains mixed-status families without legal process, or removes primary breadwinners while leaving families destitute, these actions violate constitutional protections that extend to family relationships regardless of immigration status. The psychological trauma inflicted on children through forced family separation constitutes what child development experts classify as systematic abuse, while the economic devastation imposed on remaining family members creates conditions that force American citizens into poverty and displacement that serves no legitimate governmental interest. What particularly concerns me in this analysis is the systematic coordination between federal immigration enforcement and local law enforcement agencies that circumvents constitutional protections through jurisdictional manipulation designed to avoid judicial oversight and constitutional constraints. When ICE coordinates with local police to conduct immigration enforcement during routine traffic stops, child custody exchanges, or domestic violence responses, they convert local law enforcement into immigration agents while eliminating constitutional protections that would apply to federal immigration enforcement. This jurisdictional shell game enables systematic constitutional violations while providing legal cover through enforcement coordination that deliberately obscures accountability and judicial review requirements. The intelligence community implications become apparent when examining how mass deportation operations require surveillance capabilities and coordination mechanisms that extend far beyond immigration enforcement into comprehensive population monitoring systems that could be redirected toward any group deemed threatening by executive authority. The technological infrastructure required for identifying, tracking, and apprehending millions of individuals requires systematic surveillance of communications, financial transactions, employment records, and social networks that creates comprehensive databases of personal information that exceed constitutional limitations on government surveillance. The precedent established by accepting expanded surveillance for immigration enforcement creates legal and technological frameworks that could be applied to political dissidents, religious minorities, or any group that future administrations identify as targets for systematic enforcement. Congressional oversight mechanisms prove structurally inadequate for addressing deportation operations that proceed through executive authority while systematically circumventing legislative oversight and judicial review requirements. Immigration enforcement operates through executive agencies that claim operational independence while implementing policies that violate constitutional constraints and international legal obligations that Congress has ratified through treaty commitments. The scale and pace of deportation operations exceed traditional congressional oversight capabilities, while the operational secrecy claimed by enforcement agencies prevents effective legislative supervision of constitutional compliance and human rights adherence. The international legal implications extend beyond domestic constitutional violations into systematic violation of international human rights treaties and refugee protection obligations that the United States has ratified and committed to uphold through international legal agreements. The principle of non-refoulement, which prohibits returning individuals to countries where they face persecution or torture, applies regardless of immigration status and requires individualized assessment of protection needs that current deportation operations systematically ignore. When deportation operations proceed without meaningful assessment of persecution risks, torture dangers, or humanitarian protection needs, they violate international legal commitments while damaging American credibility in international human rights advocacy and refugee protection coordination. The economic warfare dimensions become apparent when analyzing how systematic deportation of working populations disrupts labor markets, tax collection systems, and economic development in ways that harm American communities while providing competitive advantages to employers who exploit undocumented workers through substandard wages and working conditions. Mass deportation removes workers who contribute billions in tax revenue while filling essential roles in agriculture, construction, healthcare, and other critical sectors that American workers cannot or will not fill at wages that make economic sense for employers. The economic disruption caused by removing established workers and taxpayers exceeds any fiscal benefits from reduced social service usage while creating labor shortages that increase costs for consumers and reduce economic competitiveness for American businesses. Allied relationships face unprecedented strain as American deportation operations affect nationals of allied countries while violating international norms for immigration enforcement that democratic nations have collectively developed through multilateral cooperation and treaty commitments. When American deportation operations remove individuals to countries unable to receive them safely, separate families with members in allied nations, or violate consular notification requirements for foreign nationals, they create diplomatic conflicts with allied governments while undermining international cooperation on migration management, security cooperation, and economic coordination that requires predictable legal frameworks and respect for international legal obligations. The precedent established by accepting constitutional violations for immigration enforcement extends beyond immigration into broader acceptance of arbitrary enforcement tactics that could be applied to any group deemed problematic by executive authority through similar claims of operational necessity and public safety requirements. The legal theories being used to justify circumvention of due process rights, judicial oversight, and constitutional protections for immigration enforcement could be applied to political surveillance, religious monitoring, or social movement suppression through identical claims that operational efficiency requires suspension of constitutional constraints. This precedent creates systematic vulnerabilities for democratic governance that extend far beyond immigration policy into fundamental questions about whether constitutional rights apply during enforcement operations or can be suspended based on executive claims of operational necessity. The judicial system faces coordinated pressure through case overload, jurisdictional manipulation, and systematic non-compliance with court orders that threatens judicial authority while establishing precedents for executive branch defiance of judicial oversight that could extend to any area where executive agencies claim operational authority supersedes constitutional constraints. Immigration courts operate under administrative rather than judicial authority, creating conflicts of interest where enforcement agencies control both prosecution and judicial functions, while defendants lack adequate legal representation and procedural protections available in criminal courts. The systematic overwhelm of immigration courts through accelerated deportation timelines prevents meaningful judicial review while normalizing administrative proceedings that violate constitutional requirements for impartial adjudication and adequate legal process. The technological infrastructure being deployed for deportation operations includes facial recognition systems, mobile device tracking, financial surveillance, and social network analysis that creates comprehensive population monitoring capabilities that exceed constitutional limitations on government surveillance while establishing technological precedents that could be applied to broader population control and political monitoring. The databases being created through deportation operations include detailed information about mixed status families, community networks, employment patterns, and social relationships that could be used for political intelligence gathering, social movement monitoring, or targeted harassment of communities that oppose government policies. The normalization process that enables systematic constitutional violations operates through media coverage that presents deportation operations as routine law enforcement rather than extraordinary constitutional violations, while public attention focused on individual cases misses the systematic nature of due process violations and constitutional rights suspension that affects millions of individuals and families. The cumulative effect creates acceptance of enforcement tactics that would trigger constitutional crisis if applied to other populations, while establishing precedents for arbitrary government action that fundamentally alter the relationship between citizens and government authority. What makes this constitutional crisis particularly dangerous is its intersection with broader institutional degradation and political polarization that prevents effective resistance to systematic rights violations while creating political incentives for expanding arbitrary enforcement to other groups deemed problematic by partisan political considerations. The techniques being developed for immigration enforcement provide tested methods for circumventing constitutional protections that could be applied to political opponents, religious minorities, social movements, or any group that future administrations choose to target through claims of public safety necessity or operational efficiency requirements. As I conclude this analysis, I recognize that mass deportation operations represent far more than immigration policy enforcement. They represent systematic implementation of arbitrary government authority that violates constitutional principles fundamental to democratic governance while creating precedents and technological capabilities that threaten constitutional rights for all residents of the United States. The decisions being made about constitutional compliance during deportation operations will determine whether due process rights serve as meaningful constraints on government power or become theoretical protections that can be suspended whenever executive agencies claim operational necessity requires constitutional violation for effective enforcement.